The Texas sun shows no mercy, bleaching bone and breaking spirits. In the dust-choked town of Redemption, they thought they'd broken hers. They dragged her to the auction block, a burlap sack hiding her face, her name stolen by the wind. She was just another piece of property sold for a handful of silver to the highest bidder, a Comanche warrior whose face was a mask of stone. But when that rough sack was torn away and the light hit her face, the warrior, a man who had faced down death without flinching, did something no one expected. He dropped to his knees. The year of our Lord, 1875, had bled the color from everything in West Texas. The sun, a relentless hammer of brass, had beaten the landscape into submission, leaving behind a palette of beige, brown, and brittle ochre. Hope, much like the water, had become a currency scarcer than gold. It was in this crucible of dust and despair that Elara's world had been unmade. She remembered green, not the tired, dusty green of the mesquite and sagebrush that clung stubbornly to life, but the vibrant, impossible green of the Shenandoah Valley. She remembered the scent of rain on damp earth, the cool embrace of a forest canopy, the gentle murmur of the river that had been the lullaby of her childhood. Those memories were a lifetime away, a world away, separated by a chasm of violence and loss so profound it felt like a story told about someone else. The raid had come without warning, a whirlwind of fire and fury that had descended upon their small homestead near the Pease River. Her father, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the plow than the rifle, had fallen first. Her mother, screaming Elara's name, had been swallowed by the chaos. Elara, then just 17, had been seized, her own screams choked off by a rough hand. The men who took her were not Comanche or Kiowa, the tribes her father had always spoken of with a wary respect. They were white men, their faces hardened by greed and cruelty, their eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. They were Comancheros, the dregs of the frontier, who traded in whiskey guns and human lives with equal disregard. Her life since that day had been a blur of brutal marches, gnawing hunger, and a fear so constant it had become a part of her, settling deep in her bones like a chill that would never thaw. Her name, Elara, was a secret she held tight in the silent chambers of her heart. To her captors, she was merely the girl. She learned quickly that survival depended on anonymity, on making herself as small and unnoticeable as a stone on the parched earth. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes downcast, and obeyed every command with a speed born of terror. The green of her eyes, a legacy from her Irish mother, she learned to veil, letting a curtain of dull compliance fall over them. Her captors were led by a man named Silas Kane, a gaunt figure with a stringy beard and eyes that glittered with a cold reptilian light. He was a man who seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the suffering of others. His two main cronies were Jeb, a hulking brute with a vacant stare, and a wiry, rat-faced man named Finn, whose laughter was like the grating of a rusty hinge. They had other captives, a few Mexican women, and a young boy, all of them bearing the same haunted, hollowed-out look. They were all livestock, being herded to market. The market, Elara soon learned, was a clandestine gathering place, a collection of miserable adobes and hide tents, huddled in a desolate canyon, a hard 2-day ride from the nearest recognized settlement. The place had no name on any map, but the denizens of this shadow world called it La Boca del Diablo, the Devil's Mouth. It was a place where lawmen dared not tread a festering sore on the frontier, where stolen cattle, illicit whiskey, and human souls were bartered and sold. When they arrived, the air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, cheap liquor, and cooking fires fueled by greasewood. The sounds were a cacophony of drunken shouts in a dozen languages, the whinnying of horses, and the low, mournful sound of a lone guitar. Men of all stripes milled about hard-bitten prospectors, outcast soldiers, Mexican banditos, and a significant number of Native American warriors, their faces painted for trade, not war. It was the presence of the Comanche that sent a fresh spike of fear through Elara. She had heard the stories, the terrifying tales of their prowess in battle and their supposed cruelty. Silas Kane seemed to be in his element. He moved through the throng with a swaggering confidence, exchanging greetings with men who looked as though they had been carved from the same rough, unforgiving stone as he. He found his buyer in a man known only as El Martillo, the Hammer, a wealthy Comanchero trader with a sprawling operation. The negotiations were conducted in a mix of broken English and Spanish over a bottle of fiery aguardiente. Elara and the other captives were paraded before him, inspected like cattle. El Martillo ran a hand over the young boy's arm, squeezed the shoulder of one of the Mexican women, and then his gaze fell upon Elara. He walked around her, his eyes lingering on the slim line of her back, the curve of her neck. "This one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She is American, not Mexican, fresh from the East," Silas boasted. "Untouched, strong stock." El Martillo grunted. "The Comanche pay well for American girls, especially the young ones." A deal was struck. Coins clinked. The Mexican women and the young boy were led away to El Martillo's compound. But for Elara, Silas had a different plan. He was not selling her to El Martillo directly. He was using the trader as a broker. A specific party of Comanche was expected, led by a war chief of some renown. They were looking for a wife for one of their own, and Silas believed he had the perfect offering. To enhance her value, to create an aura of mystery and untouched purity, Silas came up with a cruel piece of theater. He took a rough, greasy burlap sack, the kind used for hauling grain, and roughly pulled it down over her head, plunging her into a world of scratchy, suffocating darkness. The stench of mold and rot filled her nostrils, and panic clawed at her throat. She could hear Finn's snickering laugh nearby. "There now, girl," Silas's voice was a venomous whisper in her ear. "A surprise for the lucky buyer. They won't know what they're getting until the money is in my hand. Keeps 'em honest." Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, and a rope was looped around her neck. She was led, stumbling and disoriented, to a small cleared space in the center of the makeshift settlement. An auction block, nothing more than a large, flat-topped boulder, waited. She was shoved and prodded towards it, her bare feet scraping against the rocky ground. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder as she was forced to climb onto the rock, a bizarre, faceless figure under the searing sun. The burlap was an oven, trapping the heat, and her own terrified breaths. She could hear Silas beginning his sales pitch, his voice oily and persuasive. He spoke of her supposed virtues, her strength, her youth. He was selling a ghost, a mystery, wrapped in filthy burlap. Through the coarse weave of the sack, she could see only shifting blurs of light and shadow. She felt the collective gaze of 100 unseen eyes upon her, and a wave of profound, soul-crushing humiliation washed over her. She was no longer Elara. She was not even the girl. She was a commodity, a thing her identity completely erased, hidden beneath a sack on a rock in the devil's mouth. She prayed for the earth to swallow her whole, for the memories of green fields and a mother's love to be the last things she ever knew. The bidding began. The voices swirled around her, a disorienting blend of languages and crude proposals. Silas Kane's voice was the loudest a carnival barker, selling his prize attraction. Elara stood on the rock, her body rigid, every muscle tensed against the indignity. The burlap sack was a cage, hot and suffocating. The world outside was reduced to muffled sounds and the oppressive weight of the sun. She tried to transport her mind away back to the Shenandoah, to the feel of cool grass beneath her feet, but the scratch of the rope at her neck and the rough texture of the sack against her face kept dragging her back to the horrifying present. She heard bids being called out, figures that meant nothing to her, but were the measure of her worth in this godless place. She was an object, her value debated by men whose faces she couldn't see. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Then a new voice cut through the clamor. It was deep and resonant, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, the guttural flowing cadence of the Comanche. The chaotic bidding stilled, replaced by a respectful murmur. Even Silas Kane's bombastic tone softened. A negotiation began, a back and forth between Silas and the new voice, translated by a third party. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment her fate would be sealed. The bargaining seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Finally, she heard the satisfying clink of a heavy purse, a sound that signaled the conclusion of the transaction. A grim finality settled over her. She had been sold. A hand firm, but not as brutal as Jeb's or Finn's, took hold of her arm. She was pulled from the rock, her bare feet stumbling on the loose gravel. She was led away from the noise of the central gathering, the sounds fading behind her, as she was guided through the warren of tents and adobes. She could feel the presence of several people around her, their footsteps soft and measured, so different from the clumsy stomping of Silas's crew. They walked for what felt like a mile, leaving the Devil's Mouth behind, and moving into the open desert. The air grew cleaner, the stench of the settlement replaced by the dry, earthy scent of creosote and dust. They stopped, and for a moment she was left standing alone, a blind, silent statue in the vast emptiness. She could hear the soft nickering of horses and the murmur of Comanche voices. She braced herself for what was to come, a cold dread seeping into her limbs. She heard a footstep approach. A figure stood directly in front of her. She could feel his presence, a palpable aura of stillness and authority. This was him, her new master, the man who had bought her. Then two hands grasped the bottom of the burlap sack, her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment of revelation, the moment she would be forced to look upon the face of her owner and he upon hers. She squeezed her eyes shut, a futile gesture of defiance in her sightless world. With a single decisive motion, the sack was pulled upwards, torn from her head. The sudden blinding glare of the afternoon sun was a physical blow. She gasped, flinching away from the light spots of purple and green dancing in her vision. The fresh air rushed into her lungs, and she drank it in greedily, the stale, moldy stench of the sack replaced by the clean, arid scent of the desert. As her eyes struggled to adjust, the first thing she saw was a blur of color and shape. Then the world sharpened into focus with painful clarity. She was standing in a small, temporary camp. A dozen or so Comanche warriors were there, their powerful, wiry frames relaxed but watchful. Their faces, painted with ochre and charcoal, were stoic, their dark eyes taking her in with a mixture of curiosity and impassivity. They were formidable, their presence radiating a quiet confidence that was more intimidating than any of Silas's blustering threats. But her attention was drawn inexorably to the man standing before her. He was tall for a Comanche, with broad shoulders and a lean, powerful build. His face was striking all sharp angles and high cheekbones, his skin the color of burnished copper. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair, which fell in 2 braids over his shoulders. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on her. He was not old, perhaps 5 and 20, but his expression held the gravity of a man who had seen much of life and death. This was the warrior whose voice had commanded the attention of the entire marketplace. This was the man named Kavi, a name that meant he who is silent, a rising war chief of the Nokoni band. Elara stared at him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. She braced herself for a look of lust, of ownership, of contempt. She had seen all those expressions in the eyes of men over the past months. She was prepared for the worst, but she saw none of those things in his eyes. As Kavi's gaze met hers, as he took in her face for the first time, the oval shape, the pale skin flushed from the heat, and fear, the cascade of honey-blonde hair that tumbled from its loose confines, and most of all, the startling luminous green of her eyes, his stoic mask shattered. His jaw went slack. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a sudden sharp hiss. His dark eyes widened, not with desire, but with a look of utter profound shock, of disbelief so complete it bordered on reverence. It was as if he was seeing a ghost, a spectre risen from the dust of the plains. He took an involuntary step back, his hand rising slightly as if to ward off a vision. The other warriors in the camp murmured their curiosity, turning to confusion at their leader's bizarre reaction. They had expected him to be pleased with his purchase. The girl was beautiful as promised, but this was not the look of a satisfied buyer. This was something else entirely. Kavi's gaze flickered from her eyes to her hair, then back to her eyes again, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with a memory burned into his soul. A torrent of emotions seemed to war within him, shock, pain, awe, and a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his throat working. He looked at her, not as a slave, not as a piece of property, but as a miracle and a curse walking in the flesh. And then, to the absolute astonishment of Elara and every one of his own warriors, Kavi, the silent and formidable war chief, the man who had bought her for a bag of silver, did the unthinkable. His legs seemed to lose their strength, his body folding as if under an immense, invisible weight. He dropped to his knees in the dust of the Texas plain, his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knelt before the girl he had just purchased, not as a master before his slave, but as a penitent before a holy icon, as a man utterly and completely undone. The silence that followed Kavi's action was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the sparse grass. Elara stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. The most feared man in the camp, a Comanche war chief, was kneeling in the dirt at her feet. The other warriors were equally stunned, their hands hovering near their weapons, their eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of alarm. They looked from their kneeling leader to the pale-faced girl, searching for an explanation for this unprecedented breach of custom and command. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through Elara. This was not a reaction she could understand. It was not the simple brutality she had prepared herself for. This was something strange and dangerous, a deviation from the script of survival she had so carefully memorized. In the unforgiving world of the frontier, the unpredictable was often the deadliest. One of the warriors, an older man with a face like a weathered map and a jagged scar across his left cheek, stepped forward cautiously. He spoke to Kavi in a low, urgent tone, his Comanche words sharp with concern. Kavi did not seem to hear him. He remained on his knees, his gaze fixed on Elara's face, his own expression a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He finally found his voice, but it was not the commanding tone she had heard earlier. It was a hoarse, ragged whisper, a single word spoken in the Comanche tongue, a word that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Numura, he breathed. The older warrior recoiled as if struck. The other men exchanged shocked glances, their murmuring growing louder. The word, whatever it meant, had a powerful effect on them. The scarred warrior, whose name was Tav, meaning son, turned his gaze on Elara, and for the first time she saw something other than impassive curiosity in the eyes of a Comanche. She saw awe and a touch of fear. Kavi slowly, shakily rose to his feet. He never took his eyes off her. He issued a series of quiet commands to his men. The orders were obeyed with a new hesitant urgency. One warrior was dispatched to fetch water. Another was sent to unpack a clean blanket. The atmosphere of the camp had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just a captive. She was something else, something that could bring their formidable leader to his knees. A young warrior, hardly more than a boy, approached her, his eyes averted. He held out a water-filled gourd, his hand trembling slightly. Elara hesitated, her gaze flicking towards Kavi. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Her throat was painfully dry, and she accepted the gourd, her fingers brushing against the boy's. He flinched back, as if he'd touched a hot coal. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. Kavi took a step closer, stopping a respectful distance away. He began to speak, his voice low and steady now, but laced with an undercurrent of intense emotion. He did not speak in Comanche. To Elara's utter astonishment, he spoke in English. It was not the broken, halting English of the traders, but a careful, almost formal English, learned and practiced. "Your name," he said. It was not a demand, but a question weighted with a significance she could not fathom. For months, she had been nameless. Admitting her name felt like a risk, like giving away the last piece of herself she had managed to keep hidden. But looking into his eyes, she saw no threat, only a desperate need to know. "Elara," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. Kavi closed his eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing the sound of it. "Elara," he repeated softly, testing the name on his tongue. "And your hair, your eyes. Where is your home?" "Virginia," she said, her voice barely audible. "The Shenandoah Valley." A pained expression crossed his face. He seemed to be piecing together a puzzle, and each piece caused him more anguish than the last. "My apologies for the manner of your acquisition," he said, the formal words sounding strange in the middle of the desolate landscape. "The Comancheros, they are filth, a necessary evil we sometimes endure to acquire certain goods. I did not know. I swear on the spirits of my ancestors, I did not know it was you. You know me?" Elara's confusion was a thick fog in her mind. I have never seen you before in my life." "No," Kavi agreed, his eyes full of a profound sadness. "You have not, but I know you, or rather I know her." He gestured for her to sit on the blanket that had been laid out. He sat across from her, the sun at his back. His warriors kept their distance, forming a loose protective circle around the camp, their watchfulness now directed outward, as if they expected some new threat to emerge from the horizon. 20 winters ago, Kavi began his voice taking on the quality of a storyteller before the white man's new borders. Before the great sickness took so many of our people, my father, Chief Ekama, led a war party far to the east, farther than most of our people ever travel. They were pursuing a band of Osage who had stolen horses from us. The chase was long, taking them into lands that were strange and green. Elara's heart began to beat faster. The Shenandoah. In that green land, Kavi continued his gaze distant. They came upon a settlement. My father's party was not there to raid settlers. Their quarrel was with the Osage. But one of his young warriors, a hot-headed man named Paco, saw a woman by the river. She had hair like the setting sun, and eyes the color of new leaves in spring. Kavi paused, drawing a deep breath. Paco was rash. He had seen his own sister taken by the Tonkawa years before, and some madness seized him. He took the woman. It was a thing of shame, an act without honor, for she was not an enemy. My father was angry, but the deed was done. To return her would be to admit weakness to the Osage who were watching. So they brought her back with them to the plains of Texas. He finally looked at Elara again, his eyes pleading for understanding. The woman's name was Sarah McDonnell. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. A cold shock washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. McDonnell. That was her mother's maiden name. Sarah. That was her mother's name. She was my mother. Elara whispered the words, feeling alien in her own mouth. The story was impossible, a fantastical tale, yet it resonated with a terrible, undeniable truth. Her mother had never spoken of it, but there had always been a shadow in her eyes, a sadness that Elara had never understood. Kavi nodded slowly, as if her confirmation was a blow he had been expecting. We knew her as Nomura, the one who was taken. She lived among us for nearly a year. My own mother, she was kind to her, taught her some of our words, our ways. My father protected her. Paco, the warrior who took her, was consumed by his guilt. He could never bring himself to claim her as a wife. She was a ghost among us, a reminder of a deed that brought no honor. He looked down at his hands. I was just a small boy then, 5 summers old. I remember her. I remember she would sing sad songs in her own language. I remember she cried when she looked at the moon. And I remember her eyes. I have never seen eyes like them again. Until today. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her mother's silences, her sudden bouts of melancholy, the way she would stare at the western horizon as if searching for something she had lost, and a stray memory, a half-forgotten image from her own early childhood, her mother humming a strange melodic tune, a lullaby that was not from any hymn or folk song Elara knew. It was the cadence of the Comanche. After a year, Kavi said, his voice heavy with the weight of the past, a group of Texas Rangers, led by a man named John Baylor, came to our camp under a flag of truce, seeking to trade. They saw her. They recognized her as a white woman. They demanded her return. He looked up, meeting Elara's stunned gaze. My father agreed. He knew it was the right thing to do. It was time to let the ghost go home. He returned your mother to the Rangers. They gave her a horse and pointed her east. We never saw her again. We did not know if she survived the journey or if she ever found her way back to the Green Valley. We did not know she had a child with the same sun in her hair and the same impossible green in her eyes. Elara was speechless. Her entire life, the bedrock of her own history, had just been fractured. Her mother had been a captive. She had lived among these people. And this man, this war chief, who had bought her like a stray dog, remembered her. "You knelt." Elara said the words, catching in her throat. "Why did you kneel?" Kavi's expression was one of profound shame. "Because the spirit of your mother, the ghost we wronged, has come back to us through you. Because my people committed a great dishonor against your family. And because I stood in the devil's mouth and committed the same sin. I bought the daughter of Numura. I put a price on her head. The spirits of my ancestors saw my actions today, and they were shamed. In that moment, seeing your face, I was not a war chief. I was the son of a man who had wronged your mother, and I was repeating his crime. There is no honor in that. Dropping to my knees was the only thing I could do. It was an apology to you and to her ghost, which has haunted my people for 20 years. The twist was so sharp, so unexpected, it left Elara reeling. She was not just a random captive. She was a living, breathing specter from this tribe's past. Her presence here was not an accident of fate, but a bizarre, terrible echo of history. The man who owned her was not her master, but a penitent bound to her by a crime committed before she was even born. The power dynamic had been turned on its head in a single stunning revelation. She looked at the faces of the warriors around her, and she no longer saw impassive captors. She saw men looking at the living embodiment of a tribal sin, a ghost on the plains who had come to claim a debt of honor. The revelation hung in the air, as heavy and palpable as the Texas heat. Elara felt as if the ground had been swept out from under her, leaving her untethered in a story she had never known was hers. Her mother Sarah, a captive among the Comanche. It explained so much, the deep-seated sadness. She could never hide the flinching from loud noises, the way she'd taught Elara to be quiet and watchful. She hadn't just been a cautious woman, she had been a survivor, carrying the trauma of her captivity in secret. Kavi allowed the silence to stretch, giving her time. He seemed to understand that he had not just explained a strange reaction, he had redrawn the map of her life. The other warriors remained at a respectful distance, their earlier confusion replaced by a somber understanding. The name Numura, the one who was taken, carried a weight they all felt. In their spiritual worldview, where the past was never truly past, Elara's appearance was a powerful omen, a circle being closed. "My father, Ekama Kavi," said his voice, pulling her from her thoughts. He spoke of her often in the years after she left. He carried the guilt of it. Paco, the warrior who first seized her, never recovered. He became a haunted man, seeing her ghost in the shadows. He rode out into a storm one season and was never seen again. Some said the spirits took him as payment for his crime. He gestured to Tave, the older warrior with the scarred face, who approached and sat with them. Tave was a young warrior then. He remembers your mother well. Tave looked at Elara, his weathered face softened by memory. He spoke in Comanche, his voice a low rumble with Kavi translating. He says he remembers her singing, Kavi relayed. He says the songs were full of sorrow, like a bird with a broken wing. He says, my mother Wetu tried to teach her to bead, but her hands would shake. But he says she was kind to the children. She showed them a game with a piece of string, making a cat's cradle between her fingers. He remembers you in her. The image of her mother playing cat's cradle with Comanche children was so vivid and so surreal that Elara had to fight back a wave of tears. This wasn't just a story. It was a collection of lived moments, a secret history of the woman she thought she knew. Why? Elara asked, her voice cracking. Why did she never tell us my father? He died never knowing. I lived my whole life never knowing. Kavi considered the question. Perhaps the shame was too great, or the pain. Perhaps she wanted to bury that part of her life to protect you and your father from the shadow it cast. To return to the white world after living with the people is difficult. Many are not welcomed back. They are seen as tainted, changed. Maybe silence was her only refuge. He was right. Elara recalled the whispers in the settlement, the sideways glances at women who had been in the hands of savages. They were treated as damaged goods, objects of pity and scorn. Her mother, a proud woman, would have chosen silence over that kind of shame. A new thought, cold and sharp, cut through her grief. The men who took me? Silas Kane? He knew nothing of this. He just saw a girl to sell. Yes, Kavi affirmed. He is scum who deals in misery. He saw only the color of your hair and eyes and knew it would fetch a high price. He is ignorant of the spirits he has disturbed. A dangerous light glinted in Kavi's eyes, but his ignorance will not protect him. The implication was clear. Silas Kane had not just sold a captive, he had desecrated a sacred memory. He had unknowingly delivered the daughter of Numura into the hands of the very people who had wronged her, and in doing so had made himself a party to the old crime. In the intricate code of Comanche honor and retribution, such an act could not go unanswered. What will you do? Elara asked, a tremor in her voice. You are not a captive, Elara. Kavi stated the words carrying the force of a vow. Not anymore. The silver I paid for you was not a price, but a blood debt, a down payment on an apology that is 20 years overdue. You are under my protection. You are a guest of the Nokoni people, a daughter of a woman we wronged. You are Numura's child. It is a name of sorrow, but it is also a name of respect among us. No harm will come to you here. He paused, his gaze turning back towards the direction of the devil's mouth. And those who brought you to that rock, who put a sack on your head and a price on your soul, they will answer for it. This is no longer a matter of a stolen captive. This is a matter of family honor, my father's honor, my people's honor. Over the next few hours, the camp transformed. Elara was given a space of her own, a clean buffalo robe to rest on. One of the warriors gave up his personal water skin for her use. Food was brought, strips of dried venison and sweet chewy pemmican. It was offered not as a ration to a slave, but as a dish to an honored guest. The warriors who had earlier seemed so intimidating now treated her with a mixture of reverence and cautious curiosity. They would glance at her, then quickly look away, as if her gaze held a spiritual power. She learned more names. The young boy who had given her water was Topa, meaning prickly pear. He was Kavi's nephew, and he seemed to be permanently attached to his uncle's side. He watched Elara with wide, wondering eyes. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Kavi shared more of his own story. He spoke of his father, Chief Ekama, who had died 2 years ago, not in battle, but from the coughing sickness that had swept through the tribe. He spoke of his own rise to war, chief of the constant pressure from the encroaching white settlements, the buffalo hunters, who were destroying their way of life, and the U.S. Army, who sought to force them onto reservations. My father tried to walk the path of peace in his last years, Kavi said, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He saw the world changing. He knew we could not fight the tide forever. But peace is a difficult road when the other side speaks only with guns and broken treaties. I have tried to follow his path. I trade for what we need. I fight only when we are attacked. But it is hard to keep the young men from the warpath when they see their future being stolen. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. When my father died, he spoke of your mother. He said her ghost was a weight on his spirit. He asked me to lead our people with honor, to never repeat the mistakes of the past. And today I walked directly into his greatest mistake. Elara listened, absorbing the complexities of this man and his world. He was not a savage from a fireside story. He was a leader, burdened by history and responsibility, trying to navigate a collapsing world. He was bound by a strict code of honor that she was only beginning to understand, a code that now inexplicably centered on her. She thought of her own father, an educated man from Philadelphia named Thomas Lynch, who had come west with dreams of building a new life. He had been a kind, gentle man who had loved her mother fiercely. What would he think of this, of his daughter, sitting by a Comanche campfire, being protected by the son of the man who had abducted his wife? The irony was so bitter, so profound, it was almost comical. My father's name was Thomas, she said softly. Thomas Lynch. My mother's name, before she married him, was Sarah MacDonald. Kavi and Tavi exchanged a look. Lynch, Kavi said, testing the name. We did not know his name. We knew only of a father and brother she had spoken of back in the Green Valley. James MacDonald Elara said the name coming to her. That was my mother's brother, my uncle. Tave spoke a few sharp words in Comanche. Kavi translated a new intensity in his voice. Tave says he remembers that name. James, your mother, she would say the name in her sleep sometimes. She was worried for him. It was another piece of the mosaic, another detail that lent this impossible story the solid weight of truth. These men knew her family's private history, a history they had been a part of. The connection between her world and theirs was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a fact written in memory and blood. She now understood that her journey was no longer simply about escape and survival. Her identity was intertwined with that of the Nakoni people. Her name was Elara Lynch, but here in the heart of the Comancheria, she was also Numura's child, and that name carried a power and a burden she was just beginning to comprehend. The men who had sold her thought they were finished with her. They had no idea that they had not concluded a transaction, but had ignited a fuse that reached back 20 years, and that the ensuing explosion would be one of honor, vengeance, and a reckoning on the vast, unforgiving plains of Texas. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of another scorching day. Elara had slept fitfully, her dreams a chaotic mix of green valleys, burning homesteads, and the face of a Comanche warrior kneeling in the dirt. When she awoke, the camp was already stirring, moving with a quiet, purposeful efficiency that spoke of long practice. Kavi stood by the fire, speaking in low tones with Tave and two other senior warriors. His face was grim, his jaw set. The time for reflection was over. The time for action had arrived. He saw that she was awake and walked over his moccasins, making no sound on the hard-packed earth. "We ride in a moment," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is not safe for you here. The Comancheros are without honor. When Silas Kane learns that his goods have become an honored guest, His greed will curdle into anger. He could try to take you back, or he could sell the story to the rangers, twisting it to make us seem like common kidnappers. We must be gone from this place. Where are we going? Elara asked, her voice small in the vast emptiness of the plains. To our main camp on the Brazos River. It is a 3-day ride. You will be safe there. My mother Wetu is there. She will want to see you. The prospect of meeting the woman who had been kind to her own mother sent a strange flutter of anticipation and fear through her. A horse was brought for her, a sturdy-looking Mustang with a gentle disposition. A warrior had fashioned a makeshift blanket saddle for her comfort. As she was helped onto the horse, she saw that Kavi and his warriors were no longer dressed for trade. They were prepared for battle. Their faces were painted with fresh markings of black and red. They carried not just rifles in their scabbards, but also bows and quivers of arrows. The eagle feathers in their hair seemed to bristle with a new energy. "What about Silas Kane?" Elara asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. The memory of his cruel eyes and rat-faced laugh made her skin crawl. Kavi's gaze was like flint. "I have left 2 warriors behind to watch him, to see where he goes, but our first duty is your safety. Kane's debt will be paid, but it will be paid at a time and place of my choosing." He mounted his own powerful war pony in a single, fluid motion. With a sharp cry, he led the party out of the camp, moving north at a steady, ground-eating pace. Elara rode in the center of the group, surrounded by the warriors, a shield of living flesh between her and any potential danger. They rode hard for 2 days, speaking little. The landscape shifted from desolate flats to rolling hills, dotted with scrub oak and cedar. Elara's body ached from the unaccustomed hours on horseback, but she did not complain. She watched the warriors around her, marveling at their endurance and their intimate knowledge of the land. They moved through it, not as trespassers, but as a part of it, their senses alive to every rustle of the wind, every track in the dust. On the evening of the 2nd day, as they made camp in a sheltered draw, one of the scouts Kavi had left behind rode in his horse, lathered and breathing hard. He spoke urgently to Kavi, his words sharp and fast. Elara watched as Kavi's expression darkened, his hand clenching into a fist. When the scout had finished, Kavi turned to Elara. The grim mask was back on his face. "We have a problem," he said, his voice tight. "Silas Kane is not a patient man. He and his crew, Jeb and Finn, left the Devil's Mouth yesterday. They are not riding south back to their usual haunts. They are riding north, and they have 4 other men with them. They are following our trail." A cold dread washed over Elara. "He's coming for me. He is coming for what he believes is his property," Kavi corrected, his voice laced with contempt. "His pride is wounded. He cannot allow a Comanche to get the better of him. He thinks he can ambush us, kill us, and take you back. Then he can sell you again. Or worse." Tave spoke, gesturing with his hands. Kavi nodded. "Tava says they are fools. They are 7. We are 10. But they have repeating rifles, and they are desperate men. A fight would be costly, and you would be in danger. We must avoid it if we can." But there was to be no avoidance. The next afternoon, as they crossed a wide open plain, a lookout gave a sharp cry and pointed to a ridge behind them. A line of riders was silhouetted against the sky, coming on fast. "They've caught us," Tave grunted. Kavi's orders came like whip cracks. "Tave, take her. Get her to the river. There is a stand of cottonwoods 2 miles from here. Wait for us there. Topa, you go with them." Tave grabbed the reins of Elara's horse without ceremony and kicked his own mount into a gallop. The young warrior Topa fell in beside them, his boyish face set in a determined scowl. Elara looked back over her shoulder in panic. She saw Kavi and the remaining 7 warriors turn their horses, forming a line to face the oncoming charge. They were going to stand and fight to give her time to escape. The next few minutes were a blur of terror. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plain, sharp cracks that made her flinch with every shot. Tave urged their horses on relentlessly, his face a mask of grim concentration. Elara clung to her horse, her heart pounding in her throat, praying for Kavi and his men. She was the cause of this, the focal point of this storm of violence. These men were risking their lives for her, for a debt of honor incurred 20 years ago. Finally, they reached the green slash of the cottonwood grove on the banks of the Brazos. Tave led them into the trees out of sight, and they dismounted their horses, heaving for breath. Tave stood at the edge of the trees, peering back across the plain, his rifle held at the ready. Topa stood beside him, clutching a bow that seemed too big for him. The waiting was an agony, the distant sounds of the battle rising and falling with the wind. It seemed to go on for an eternity. Elara paced back and forth, wringing her hands, her mind filled with terrible images of the fight. At last the gunfire sputtered and died. A tense silence fell over the plains. Elara held her breath. Had Kavi won? Or had Silas Kane and his men triumphed? Then they saw them. A group of riders emerging from the heat haze. Tave raised his rifle, squinting. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. It was Kavi. He was riding tall, and 4 of his warriors were with him. But that was all. 5 of them. Where were the other 3? As they rode into the grove, Elara saw the cost of her safety. One of the warriors was slumped over his horse, a dark stain spreading across his tunic. Another had a crude bandage tied around his arm. Kavi himself had a bloody gash on his cheek. He slid from his horse, his face etched with grief and fury. 2 of my men are dead, he said, his voice raw. And Chaitan is wounded badly. He looked at the fallen warrior, his friend, and a muscle worked in his jaw. And Silas Kane, Elara whispered. He is dead, Kavi said, his voice flat and cold. And his men with him. We took them all down. But the price was too high. He walked over to the wounded warrior Chaitan and spoke to him gently. It was clear the man would not last long. Kavi knelt beside him, taking his hand, and began to chant a soft, low death song to guide his friend's spirit on its journey. Elara watched her heart breaking. 2 men were dead, another dying, all because of her. The weight of the blood debt, which she had thought was owed by the Comanche, had suddenly been reversed. Now she owed them, a debt of blood that could never truly be repaid. Kavi finished his song and stood up. He walked over to her, his face a mask of sorrow. This was not your fault, Elara, he said, as if reading her mind. This was the fault of greedy, violent men. This is the world we live in. We fight to protect our own. Today, you are one of our own. He looked at her then, and in his eyes, she saw not just the grim war chief, but the man burdened by leadership and loss. The man who had knelt for her, fought for her, and lost his men for her. The connection between them, forged in a history she never knew, was now sealed in fresh blood. Come, he said, his voice softer now. My mother is waiting. The story of Numura has a new chapter. We will write it together. He helped her onto her horse, his touch gentle. As they rode towards the main Nokoni camp with their dead and wounded Elara knew that her old life was gone forever. She was no longer just Elara Lynch, the girl from Virginia. She was Numura's child, a name that carried the weight of the past and the burden of the present. Her path was now intertwined with that of the Nokoni with Kavi, a man bound to her by a complex tapestry of sin, honor, and sacrifice. The sack had been pulled from her head, and in its place she had found a new, complicated, and dangerous identity, one she would have to carry for the rest of her days on the vast, blood-soaked plains of Texas. Elara's journey has just begun. The ghosts of the past have risen, and a debt of blood has been paid with blood. Her fate is now tied to Kavi and the Nokoni people, a path fraught with danger, honor, and the struggle to find a new identity in a world determined to erase it. What happens next? Does she find peace, or will the violence of the frontier claim her as well? This story of survival, honor, and the untamed West captured your imagination. Please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you want more. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this epic tale. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the trail.